Greeting from London and from the IISS, and welcome to our webinar on the resurgence of interstate tension in the Americas in a complex geopolitical landscape. My name is Irene. I'm Senior Fellow for Latin America and Complex Security and Development at the IISS, and I'm very pleased to be chairing the session today on a very timely issues, and on an issue which is worth more strategic analysis, which hopefully we will provide today with our wonderful panelists. Conflict dynamics in Latin America have been mainly linked to organized crime in the past few decades, with the region being largely spared from interstate conflict. The last major conflict dates back to the 30s, the Chaco War, you will remember, between Bolivia and Paraguay. And also, even if the US has been intervening in the region quite frequently in modern history, its last direct intervention, military intervention, occurred at the end of the 80s in Panama, to oust Manuel Noriega. Tension between states have been in the region largely resolved through diplomatic channels in recent decades, including various regional organizations, among which the Organization of American States. Additionally, Brazil has been playing a mediating role in South America to diffuse friction. And also, I would say that the specific conformation, geopolitical conformation of Latin America, so close to the US, has translated in a unipolar geopolitical order, which, with extra-regional power, generally avoiding direct intervention in regional affairs. Even China, which we have seen becoming a dominant player, at least economically, in the region in recent decades, in recent years, has primarily focused, as I said, in economic engagement with the region, refraining from directly challenging the US military and political influence in the region, and at least until now. But what we have seen in recent years, and even more so in recent months, has been intensified great power competition in the region, coupled with ideological, political, and economic tension among Latin American countries, but also with the US, especially under Trump. And all these have really led to a resurgence of interstate tension in the Americas, exposing vulnerability in regional conflict prevention mechanisms and also raising the risk of interstate disputes. Key flashpoints include border dispute, territorial claims driven by geoeconomic interest, and bilateral tension stemming from domestic conflict trends, notably uncontrolled human displacement, like in the case between Dominican Republic and Haiti. We have lots of examples. We have Venezuela territorial dispute with Guyana on the Essequibo region. We have tense relationship between Colombia and Venezuela, the unresolved Nicaragua-Colombia border dispute, the ongoing friction between Dominican Republic and Haiti I previously mentioned. Moreover, in the last few months, we have seen increasingly recent threats by the new administration of Donald Trump to intervene militarily in Mexico against the cartels, take back the Panama Canal, or even annex Canada as a 51st state of the US. And this really highlights, for the first time in many years, the potential risk of territorial occupation or military operation by the regional hegemon in the region, potentially opening the way for inter-regional conflict or even global conflict if one extra-regional power with vested geopolitical interest decide to intervene. Things about the Panama Canal, for instance, in China. So I'm joined today by a fantastic panel of experts to delve into these trends, better understand the risk, and also hopefully really think about some of the mitigation strategy and solution for that. I will briefly present the speakers in order of their speaking remarks, and then we get started. So I'll start with Dr. Monica Serrano, who is a research professor of international relations at Colegio de Mexico. She's also a member of the international faculty of the doctorate on organized crime at the University of Milano. She's a member of the United Nations University Council and one of our dear associate fellows for Latin America. So thanks, Monica, for being with us again. Monica's research focuses on interfaces between security, drug trafficking, organized crime, and human rights. She is especially concerned with consequent tension for the regional and global governance architecture. She has published several books, articles, and book chapters on international institutions, human rights, and drug policy. Monica was educated at Colegio de Mexico and received her PhD from Oxford University in the UK. We are also joined by Dr. Evan Ellis, who is a research professor of Latin American studies at the US Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, where it focuses on the region relationship with China and other non-Western hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. Evan had previously served in the Secretary of State Policy Planning Staff with responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement issues. And he has published over 550 works, including 5 books. Evan was educated at Eastern Michigan University and received his doctorate in comparative politics from Purdue University. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Feliciano Guimarães, who is the academic director and senior researcher at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI. He's also associate professor at the Institute of International Relations at the University of Sao Paulo. His research focus are on Brazilian foreign policy and the intersection of public opinion and foreign policy in Brazil and Latin America. Feliciano is also associate editor of the academic journal Foreign Policy Analysis and editor-in-chief of the SEBRI journal. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Sao Paulo and a Master of International Relations from the State University of Campinas. Thanks so much for joining us. It's a privilege to have you here today and be able to discuss with you those very timely topics. Before we start, just a quick note on housekeeping. We welcome questions from the audience, so we will try to make this conversation as interactive and inclusive as possible. To that end, it would be really good if you could add your question comments in the Q&A box you see on your screen, and we will pick the question up during the course of the conversation and also in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So with that, we will get started with a round of initial remarks by our speakers. We will then open the floor for discussion. Each speaker will have around 12-13 minutes to discuss their initial remarks, and then, as I said, we will start with the question and answer. Monica, if I can start with you, I guess really one of the things we've been hearing a lot in the last few months has been really Trump and Mexico, right? And that's North America. It's one key. It has become one key area of contestation if we talk about interstate tension and tensions in general. So could you give us an overview of the current state drivers and also outlook for this kind of tension in North America, please?
Yes, Irene. Well, thank you very much for having me in this really interesting and timely conversation. You pose the question of what is the current state of interstate tensions in North America. I think that after 3 or more decades of NAFTA and free trade in North America, the idea that tensions will resurge was not something that was really expected, although we had already, of course, the experience of the first Trump administration as a warning of what could come. I think that unlike the first term where there were some dikes containing what Trump could do, some more perhaps moderate voices within his cabinet, at the present, given what we have seen, I think it's fair to say that the idea of North America as a driver of interstate relations between Canada, the US, and Mexico is gone. And it was gone even before Trump assumed power. Before he reached the White House, we heard some Canadian voices calling openly now for a return of bilateralism and to sign and negotiate a new free trade agreement between Canada and the US and to kick out Mexico from the scene. Mexico was then bashed with Premier Doug Ford from Ontario at the forefront of premiers from around the provinces in Canada, bashing on Mexico, accusing Mexico of bringing cheap Chinese parts to North America, slapping made in Mexico stickers, that's what he said, to then ship them through the US and Canada, causing US and Canadians' jobs to be lost. Ironically, yet, once in the White House, Trump's handling of Canada appears to have been particularly vicious, so vicious that it contrasts with a still harsh but sprinkled with one or two compliments to President Sheinbaum. The harsh tone used to Mexico was still harsh, but as I said, it was sprinkled with these compliments addressed to President Sheinbaum. Trump first called Canada the 51st state of the US, then referred to Prime Minister Trudeau as governor. And then I think, despite Canada's efforts to distance itself from Mexico in terms of security, at least since 9/11, the reality is that Trump's handling of Canada has been basically the same as Mexico, if not worse. The first threats came uh, uh, as has to be the case with Trump, threats to raise tariffs, but they were linked to fentanyl. And Canada and Mexico were basically put at the same level in terms of fentanyl, despite the fact of the fact that the bulk of the fentanyl found in the US nowadays is coming from Mexican sources and Mexican cartels. That is, I think, in a nutshell, the radiography of North American relations. We are, of course, expecting the tariffs apparently starting on the 2nd of April, 25%, directly affecting what has been the axis of North American integration, which is the automobile sector, and that can have dire consequences for Mexico and for Canada, but for the US as well. Despite the fact that several economies, the most prominent economies, have warned the Trump administration that an increase in tariff is going to be detrimental not only to the neighbors, but most significantly to the US because it will raise inflation. He seems to be persuaded, insisting that even if it's hurtful, he's persuaded is going to be to the benefit of the US. The second point you mentioned is the listing of the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. We had this coming, and we knew the chances of this becoming a reality were high, not least because even before Trump reappeared in the electoral scene, there were a number of prominent legislators from the Republican Party calling for this, including voices that had been associated with more moderate trends, such as Lindsey Graham. They were insisting on the need of designating the cartels as terrorist organizations. This comes after a government in Mexico, 6 years of López Obrador government, in which the president was persuaded that the main factor driving the illicit drug market in Mexico and other illicit markets was poverty and inequality. And as a result of that, what we had was basically the lack of a strategy to deal with the criminal organizations. And in the view of many experts, including myself, this emboldened and empowered criminal organizations and allowed perhaps a more rapid mutation into forms of organized crime. I want to say, and I want to emphasize that I am persuaded, and I really want to call attention to a recent report issued by International Crisis Group on violence and drug trafficking, and the way in which also the money that drug trafficking brings into the region has been also the main driver of this mutation. I think the lack of a strategy facilitated the process, but the process is a result of drug policy, punitive drug policies that inflate the prices of drugs, and that inflating those prices hand over large sums of money into criminal organizations and allow them then to corner authorities through, as we know, silver or plomo. Um, the designation of the cartels as terrorist organizations, of course, increases the volume and paves the way to the possibility of military means to deal with the cartels. But it fundamentally does not change the logic of the strategy, which is to dismantle the organization, something that the US has failed to do in half a century of efforts. What we know, because of the logic of illicit markets, which is economically above all, economic in nature above all, is that you may dislodge a leader, you may arrest, kill, but the reality is that the business continue, and you may complicate those engaged in the business, but the business will continue and eventually hand over into new hands who will most likely be more powerful and more daring. Um, the Mexican government was forced through the pressures exerted by Trump to hand over 29 traffickers with no judicial process whatsoever. They were just like put in a DHL envelope and forwarded to the US with total disregard to the rule of law. The consequences of this, as we know from the wars unleashed by the kidnapping of one of the top leaders of the Cartel de Sinaloa, are very detrimental to Mexico, because what they do is, by breaking the cartels, and this is something also the crisis group reports and highlights, I think, with echoing what many of us have said for years, what happens is that it interrupts and it breaks the flow of drugs. And by doing that, it leaves many actors who have been dependent upon drug money for their lavish lifestyles to then resort to more predatory tactics, which push them into activities that resemble more organized crime as we know it, particularly through extortion. So the impact of the designation and the actions that may come from this designation will most likely exacerbate violence in Mexico and instability, will not very likely affect the illicit market. It will make it more unstable, more disorganized, but it will not necessarily stop the flow of drugs, perhaps drive it through other routes. But while in the US, you have the number of drug addicts that are active in the US, the demand for drugs, including fentanyl or heroin, will continue. I could say a few things about fentanyl and China, but perhaps I can come back in a second round if there is time. I'm in your hands.
Thanks, Monica. I had just a very small follow-up question, because we've seen a lot of articles recently on what you were mentioning, Canada, the Canada link with fentanyl, right? Is that something that it's really, I mean, I understand that there are actually already operation of cartels, Mexican cartels in Canada related to fentanyl, but is it, how big is the phenomenon? I mean, is it something that it's really, it really justify what Trump is doing, but, as you were saying, kind of banding together Mexico and Canada on the fentanyl issues, or is it just some beginning of operation there?
Perhaps there is some beginning of operation, and I would not be surprised, in fact, if the pressure on the Mexican cartels increases and is sustained in the manner in which it has been, that we may even see a relocation of the labs to the US territory itself. Until recently, most of the fentanyl, and Canada had a fentanyl problem, but it was mostly local. It had no transnational connection. There might be some relocation of Mexican cartels, but it's very far away. It is too risky for them. I would tend to think that it has been more the personal antipathy of Trump to Trudeau and whatever reasons he has to turn Canada into a piñata as well as Mexico. Let me just finish by saying something about the justice system, because the extradition of traffickers or the killing of traffickers, as we know from Colombia and Mexico, represents, I think, in the most tragic way, the dilemma in which these punitive drug policies have turned countries in Latin America into a very perverse dynamic by which the drug policies create the problems, exacerbate the problems, turn criminals into huge threats that then force these countries into securitizing their own sovereignty, presenting themselves as threats so as to appeal for US help to contain the problem. And the extradition represents that tragically, in the sense that keeping these drug traffickers in prisons in the countries becomes a problem and a threat. And in a way, ejecting them, sending them in a DHL envelope is a short-term relief, but in effect is a relief that comes at a huge cost because it weakens the justice system of the countries in the region. And more to the point, these criminals end up in the US negotiating their court sentences and passing on information whose credibility is really something that we need to ask seriously. I have no doubt that the head of Mexico's police, who was sentenced in the US, Garcia Luna, was a corrupt officer. I have no doubt. But the court case and the sentence was based on testimonies. There was no hard evidence whatsoever that could verify his links or his protection to the Sinaloa cartel. And that is the other, I think, dilemma and very perverse result of this dynamic that now affects the whole region. The way in which governments in the region, by going after one cartel, by default, end up benefiting the other that is not under attack. And there is no way strategically that a government can confront simultaneously a 2 or 3 war. We saw that with Calderon. Calderon tried that madness, and the only thing he managed was to send the homicide rate to the roof. And as I said, I mean, Trump is just the last episode in a century-long history of drug relations with the region that now include, as very problematic cases, Ecuador with over 400% rise in homicide, and Costa Rica, the country which was stable, whose democracy was considered a jewel in the region, whose homicide rate has doubled as well, as a result of the way in which Costa Rica is now a transit point for cocaine and other drugs.
Thanks, Monica. It's interesting what you were saying about the ability of the state to go just after 1 or 2 cartels, or you know, not all of them. And I suspect also the designation of just 8 cartels as a foreign terrorist organization will also maybe help other cartels or other drug trafficking organizations. So clearly, when we're singling out just 8 of them, there are many others in the region, including, you know, in the very powerful drug trafficking organization in Brazil and other organizations. So I think even there's going to be a bit of reconfiguration possibly in that sense. But thanks so much, and I think there'll be lots of follow-up questions more on the as you were mentioning, also on the justice system and also deportation, all those kind of issues we have seen. Also, not just deportation of criminal, but also deportation of migrant, which is another.
Yeah, Venezuelans. I mean, it's just.
Yeah. which I'm sure we will have some consideration on that. But let's turn now to Evan and really look more at the I would say the great power competition, the fact that it's accelerating. What does it mean for conflict in the Americas, and also interstate tension, and also I would say what are the interlinkages with transnational organized crime. So now at the moment we have not just the usual transnational domestic kind of nexus of conflict in Latin America, but more we also have this kind of geopolitical on top, and how the three levels combine with each other. Please, Evan.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and thanks to ISSS. It's a pleasure to be here among my distinguished colleagues. Although I'm currently employed by the U.S. Army War College, what I'm going to say today and speak very frankly is going to be in my own personal academic opinion. Also, as we discussed, I have a brief presentation I want to put up just really to reinforce some of the points I want to make in the next 12 or 13 minutes or so. And so hopefully you should be seeing it on the screen right now. Really talking broadly about the resurgence of interstate conflict in the hemisphere. So the first question I wanted to step back a moment and address is the question of, when we're talking about the resurgence of interstate conflict in Latin America, how did we get here from what we used to call, or Francis Fukuyama used to call, the end of history? And just very briefly, it's useful to recall that when we're talking about the China-US conflict specifically, there's been an evolution, first of all, in the way that China is engaged from the region, from the time in which it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 with a takeoff of its bilateral trade. And then as it evolved to more of a physical presence, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. And then in 2013, the way in which the new policies of Xi Jinping replacing Hu Jintao really led to a much more aggressive posture, the famous wolf warrior diplomats, etc. Now, at the same time that was happening, you also had what I would say is an evolution in U.S. thinking about how to understand China, not only in Latin America, but globally. I saw this over the years because I've been following this since the early 2000s. Secretary of States previously, such as Assistant Secretaries of Western Hemisphere, such as Arturo Valenzuela or Roberto Jacobson, expressing a discomfort towards China's advance in Latin America, but still the sense that we could continue to work with them. I think the key moment of change came with the 2017 national security strategy of the incoming first Trump administration, where for the first time there was a focus both in our messaging and our posture, this notion of China as an adversary more than just a state that we were trying to work with. Also, in that same regard, important to emphasize that decoupling was also something that's evolved. You saw it begin, I think, in important ways with the first Trump administration, for example, with that national security strategy, with a very hawkish Secretary of State that I worked under, Mike Pompeo, with President Trump's Section 301 tariffs. But you saw a decoupling evolve with, for example, the continuation of these policies under Joe Biden, and frankly, also the global supply disruptions that occurred during COVID-19 and with the Russia-Ukraine war. Also, I would argue, really reinforced this idea that not only because of the China-US competition, but also questioning about the nature of the global just-in-time supplies system. I would also argue that there's been a process of deterioration of the global institutional order that accelerated at the same time. And in part, this, in my judgment, reflected an interaction between China pursuing its own objectives and a range of illiberal actors from Venezuela to Iran and Russia that, although they had very different agendas, there was certainly not an alliance with China. But that synergy between those two empowered financially those actors to strengthen their attacks on the system. And certainly there were other dimensions. For example, the U.S., what I would consider an excessive use of sanctions during this period, what I would call a new multilateralism with the rise of new organizations in Latin America like CELAC or trans-regional organizations like the BRICS. And I think at the same time, also yet another factor, what I would call the deterioration of the viability of liberal democracy. To me, what has happened in recent years, we haven't thought much about why did the thinking which seemed so inherent about the viability of liberal democracy during the post-Cold War period, why is it eroded so much in Latin America? And I would argue that there is a combination of factors. One has to do with the way in which technology has impacted our democratic system, not only internet interconnectivity, but also things like the ability to tailor messages through social media, TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp, things like that. And that in combination with the ability to manipulate images and content through artificial intelligence and big data, I would say has really put some hard questions, especially when weaponized by actors such as Russia. Really has imposed some hard questions in the way that technology impacts the way we think about the world, and in many ways has led to a polarization of democracies, not only in Latin America, but within the United States. On top of that, I think important to recognize the level of transnational organized crime, the fragmentation, and the problems in the performance of democratic systems, many of which my colleague Monica just talked about. And I would say you saw that even before COVID in some of the expressions in Ecuador and Chile with protests in 2019, continuing in Colombia with protests such as the Minga in Bogota, and all of that, I would say, brought us to this Trump moment. But then also in a philosophical level, I would argue that there's yet another piece, which is that in many ways, by contrast to what those like myself who grew up during the Cold War lived, you have in many ways China bringing 800 million people out of poverty. The perception of that, I would say, changes the debate about what is the proper role of the state in development versus the free market. And frankly, also as Chinese architectures that bring security at the expense of individual privacy, as those architectures through the domination of companies like Huawei have spread throughout the world, there has been an imposition of a very different balance between efficiency and privacy than what we had previously. So I think there's a lot of different moments that were occurring. But so when I turn to the current moment, let me be very clear here. So first of all, for me, the moment that we are actually living in, I would say, regards all of these things I just talked about. This new illiberal order dynamic, stressed institutions, stressed democracy, the PRC providing alternatives, and what I would frankly call a broken U.S. model. So first, a couple comments about the broader themes here. One, I think despite some of the difficulties in Latin America, it's important to distinguish that there are not yet any actual, what I would call proxy wars. And so, if we look at what Iran is doing with Hezbollah in the Middle East, or with the Houthis, or North Korea's relationship with Russia, you really don't see that yet in Latin America. Nor, I would argue, is there any real interstate conflict, although certainly we see threats of it with Venezuela and Guyana. But I would say when you really peel back those dynamics in the region, what they really look like a lot more is a breakdown in institutional order. States, that have become captured by criminal elites, in the case of Venezuela, and empowered by certain extra-regional friends, such as Iran and Russia. So I come back to many of the things that my colleague Monica, Dr. Serrano, said in terms of what the current cycle is all about. I would say on the one hand, as she rightly alluded to, you have a flood of different dynamics driven in part by the demand of the U.S. market. There's a flood of cocaine coming through Colombia, and I'd say that also owes to some of the failed policies of the previous Santos administration with the 2016 peace accords, continued with, I think, some of the poor implementation and poor conceptualization of the total peace policy by the Petro administration. But again, just the amount of cocaine corruption and violence that you see there, problems in Peru with institutional weakness, political fragmentation, the weakness not only of Boularte's government, but also the Congress there, at a time in which you have a takeoff in cocaine production in different areas, as well as illicit mining. Bolivia, a similar process is going on, the economic collapse with the neglect of the oil sector, and really a type of kind of narco-civil war within the MAS between Evo Morales and Luis Arce, and the old guard elite of the Media Luna. Ecuador, I think, reflecting some of the alternative drug routes and the ways in which the integration of Mexican facilitators like the Cartel de Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación has interacted with the once small-time Ecuadorian gangs, Los Lobos, etc., and Colombian narcos to really explode violence there. In the case of Mexico, I certainly agree that the combination of U.S. drug demand has led to what is, at all levels, a concern of state capture. At the Mexican federal level, Dr. Serrano mentioned the Garcia Luna case, and certainly all administrations have had their concern. We can talk about AMLO's frequent visits to Badiraguato and the home of the mother of El Chapo Guzman, but clearly some impacts through the region. And also in the Caribbean, the synergy between drug flows to the U.S., gangs and guns have led to unprecedented levels of violence. And certainly the migration crisis, 8 million Venezuelans leaving the region in recent years, plus the migration crisis in Cuba, Haiti, Ecuador. So to me, when we look at all of these things, the violence that we're living right now, I believe, really reflects issues of governance and corruption and criminality as much as anything else. Having said that, let me, my last slide here, for me, when we talk about the transnational organized crime violence, it's also important to reflect that, especially in the Mexican case, a lot of what goes out of Mexico's Pacific coast and what goes out of South America reflects not only demand to the U.S., but demand by Europe, especially for cocaine and traditional synthetic drugs. You see new actors in South America like Italy's Ndrangheta and the Albanian mafia. You see also new transnational organized crime capabilities, drones, UUVs, et cetera, and new trans-Pacific flows, whether it's fentanyl from China and Turkey and elsewhere, whether it's human trafficking, money laundering involving Chinese organizations. So having said all of this about what I believe is the core criminal dynamic of this, I think it's also very important when we talk about conflict in the Americas to talk about what I think is a idiosyncratic U.S. moment. To be very frank, and in my academic opinion, I think what is so unusual is the idea that what is the most powerful country in the world and the sustainer of the international global order, the United States, has taken a dramatic turn. In other words, the idea of somehow that the U.S. had an exceptionalism that would make it different in terms of disillusionment with democracy, frustration of neglected. I think the first Trump moment and the polarization that occurred with Biden and the second Trump moment we're living now is Dr. Serrano pointed out even more forcefully, reflects that the U.S. ironically is like everyone else, but in turning to its own moment of radicalism and institutional crisis, that creates a tragedy on an unprecedented global scope. To me, many of the things with the incoming Trump administration with respect to the threats to invade Panama or Greenland or Canada are in many ways should be understood more as fabrications by a exceptionally dominant executive actor more than a change in the nature of the international system per se, but nonetheless very, very concerning. And I think a lot of the other effects that are beginning to tear apart the institutional fabric of the system and change its political dynamic have to be recognized as reflecting directly the dynamics of the incoming administration in a very idiosyncratic way. The threats of tariffs that could, impact TMAC, USMCA, the dismantling in the U.S. of the traditional U.S. government institutions, including USAID, the capture by President Trump's personnel of institutions, including the naming and in many ways weaponizing offices like the Attorney General, and even within the Defense Department, the Judge Advocate General organization, a certain culture of fear and now threats of a prosecution of judges. So I think from a traditional IR standpoint, it's critical to the unusual nature of the moment that we are living, in the way in which the traditional processes of U.S. political decision-making, National Security Council and state and defense, and even congressional oversight, I think some of those processes have been dramatically eroded just by the current administration. And then finally, I think important to note that the U.S. semi-withdraw from certain institutions, and China's advance into some of those institutions accelerated by that withdrawal, whether UN organizations like the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate, the dramatic change that we now have in the OAS, moving from Luis Almagro to Alberto Ramdin and his China-oriented, friendly posture. Obviously, the collapse of others, such as NATO around the world, new institutions being empowered like SLAC and the BRICS, and yet without the same capability to replace those old organizations. And then a final thought I want to end on also is that although I don't think that a global conflict with China over Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific is likely, when we think about war in the Western Hemisphere, we're not just talking about criminal war anymore. We're not talking about the prospect of small interstate, will Venezuela invade Guyana? But the prospect of a U.S.-China war in the Indo-Pacific would involve Latin America in multiple ways that we don't often talk about, whether it's the fight over Caribbean sea lanes and the Panama Canal, the fight in space from Western Hemisphere skies from places like Argentina, the possibility of the exploitation of ports like the port of Chancay in the case of Peru and many others. So I think it's a real paradigm shift that we have, but also a moment that is a unique moment reflecting the change that has occurred in the United States. And so, again, thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. With that, I turn it back to you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Evan. That was fascinating. I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question because it's really interesting what you were saying about China, US, no? And this is kind of a very unusual moment and could be also very dangerous because of, whether it's really going to the competition between the two is going to really go out of control, and with Taiwan and so on. It's interesting what you were saying that Latin America would be part of that in case that occurs. How do you assess the probability for that? Because I guess on one side we have a much more aggressive rhetoric from Trump, and you say it's probably unlikely that China will eventually invade Taiwan. But how do you see? I mean, do you see it more likely now with Trump, or how do you assess that? And I guess I guess we'll have the opportunity later on to also expand a little bit on those different elements you mentioned on the obviously the Latin American part of a possible war between the two countries.
It's a great question. And for me, it's complicated. The risks, I wouldn't say, are not greater or less, but the nature of the risks have shifted. I think with the aggressive trajectory that Xi Jinping has been on before and the expansion of Chinese military capabilities and confidence, I think you had a much more firm commitment under Joe Biden to defend, working with U.S. allies, Taiwan. I think some of that with the shift in Ukraine and elsewhere is now called that into question, which might embolden the PRC anymore. To me, I continue to see that Xi is not in any hurry, although certainly by 2027 and certainly by the end of his term, he would like to make the end of Taiwanese autonomy part of his legacy. And so that's a psychological factor. There's also the question of military superiority, that the temptation that comes from both the distraction of the U.S. elsewhere and the sense that, if the U.S. has undermined, its relationship with NATO, if there's a perception that the U.S. establishment is in a bit of disarray, is this a fleeting moment? Also, it's likely that it wouldn't necessarily just be an out-of-the-box invasion, amphibious ships going across the strait. It could start out as an attempt to strangle Taiwan through a blockade that ends in miscalculation in escalation. So I think the risk is there, primarily by miscalculation, driven by the idea of wanting to do this eventually. I think I worry that it actually could end in a non-defense of Taiwan, either by a Taiwan in some ways ceding or being forced into ceding, feeling like it had no other option, which would open up a new set of changes. For example, the ability of the PRC geographically to project itself beyond the first island chain across the Pacific, Guam, et cetera, and changing the impact, the calculation of other allies there. But again, really coming to this idea that if I had to say 20, 30% prospect that some type of war could occur. But again, if it does, just recognizing that although Latin America certainly does not seek to be part of that war, it's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of, if you look at the geography of where U.S. forces would deploy from, they would go through the Caribbean. The PRC operates certain facilities in the Caribbean that would logically be positioned to disrupt. The PRC would have an imperative to shut down the Panama Canal in deniable ways. The PRC would naturally be looking to access to space from Venezuela, et cetera. If there's a political crisis in Chancay and in Peru, it would be a logical place from which to resupply PRC, PLA Navy warships operating in the Caribbean. So it's not that Latin America is being asked aside or looked aside, but it's a matter of the strategic imperatives of geography if that type of global war actually occurred.
Thanks. No, that's really quite scary, but super interesting. And finally, Feliciano, I mean, South America, that's actually as also Monica and especially Evan has hinted, obviously there are dynamics there which are more connected to, obviously, problem of criminal governance and breakdown of institution. So I guess my question, and also for you, for your, we discussed obviously what you would be covering, is really what is the situation in South America, and what is the role of Brazil, what is the positioning of Brazil in all of that? Because clearly Brazil, it's a leader in the region, it's part of BRICS, it has a very long-standing ambition to play a great power role. So where do we stand in all that in South America, and also Venezuela, of course, which is one of the big crises there?
Thank you, Irene, for the questions, and thank you everybody else for being here today. It's a pleasure. It's my first time at the IISS event. I hope it's the first of many to come. I'd like to thank you for the invitation, and also I'd like to congratulate my colleagues here, Dr. Serrano and Dr. Ellis, for being here with me. What I'm going to talk about today, trying to answer Irene's question, is what is the role of Brazil in the possibility of interstate or the return of interstate wars in South America? And I'm going to use the word South America instead of Latin America, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Today, the most important concern of Brazil of the return of interstate war is the crisis of Venezuela, right? So as SEBRI, we have been discussing for more than a year now the many aspects of the political crisis going on in Venezuela and how that crisis is affecting Brazil's domestic politics and how it's affecting Brazil's capacity to act as a regional leader, which is already a very controversial position here for Brazil in the region. The crisis itself, the political crisis, the electoral crisis of last year, was already in itself a very complicated issue, but then Venezuela added in 2023, before the 2024 election, the problem of Essequibo, right? The possibility of invading Guyana. And if you look at the map, if Venezuela moves forward to invade Guyana, Venezuela will envelop Brazil's northern border state, which is Roraima. For the first time since maybe 1980s, when Brazil deployed troops to counter the possibility of an Argentine invasion of Chile, Brazil had to deploy troops in the northern border. We now have created a new brigade in the north, which is involves around 20,000 new additional troops, and we have moved hundreds of armored vehicles and also hundreds of new anti-armor missiles to defend this northern state of Roraima against a possible invasion of Essequibo. So that in itself is a complication that Brazil has not foreseen for quite some time. So my idea here to you is to discuss a little bit the implications of this possible return of interstate war in South America and how Brazil is playing a role in there. But we have to have in mind that this is not a problem of Venezuela and Guyana itself, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, and Guyana, but also it's a crisis that involving other extra-regional powers, such as Russia, China, Iran, and the United States. From a Brazilian perspective, the United States is an extra-regional power, right? It doesn't belong to South America, so it's from another area. So Brazil's number one priority in foreign policy is to prevent and avoid extra-regional powers to be closer to Brazil's border. Right? And that includes the United States. Right? And as if Venezuela is connected more to China, Russia, and Iran, then Guyana is closer to the United States and the United Kingdom. So this extra-regional powers that are much more powerful than Brazil are operating near our northern border. And this is a priority for Brazil to avoid that. But how is Brazil responding to this shift, right? The short answer is not very well. Right? Over the past 3 administrations, Brazil has oscillated between a strategic ambiguity, diplomatic isolation, and tactical inconsistency. During Presidents Temer and Bolsonaro, Brazil chose isolation of Venezuela, so full isolation. Right? Brazil's severe diplomatic relationships with Caracas in 2020, trade between the two countries collapsed from $6 billion in 2013 to $750 million in 2023, and the forecast for 2024 is only $250 million of trade. Venezuela turned to Russia for weapons, China for oil and loans, Cuba for intelligence, and now to Iranian intelligence how to avoid and how to maneuver international sanctions. Right? When Lula returned to government, they decided to have a different approach, which is engagement of Venezuela, diplomatic engagement of Maduro. But it was full of missteps. So the first one was to reopen Brazil's embassy in Caracas, but it took almost 1 year for Brazil to appoint a new ambassador there. We have a diplomatic mission back in Caracas, but it's a very small one. It used to have a very big one operation there with a couple of consulates. Now it's just the embassy. We hosted Maduro's for a state visit into May 2023, sort of welcoming Maduro back to South America before the South America Leaders Summit in Brasilia. That was a mistake in itself because the whole meeting in Brazil and the whole discussion in Brazil was about Maduro's visit, if it was right or wrong, and we did not discuss the meeting itself, which is Brazil is the only country in South America that is capable to invite every other South American leader to a meeting. Right? We had the meeting in July. In a Mercosur meeting in Uruguay, Lula admitted that he did not know who Maria Corina Machado was. It was for my amazement that the president, already in power for 6 months, did not know who was the #1 opposition leader in Venezuela. It also shows a lot how Brazil was very far. I mean, at least from a state level, very far away from what's going on in Venezuela. We were a witness. We joined the Barbados Agreement that we all know, but with no enforcement tools. Then came the Essequibo crisis, catching Brazil completely off guard. It revealed Brazil's intelligence gaps and forced a rapid militarization of Brazil's northern border, as I previously mentioned. During the Venezuela electoral crisis of last year, Brazil has tried to walk a tight rope, not fully condemning Maduro's to preserve diplomatic channels, not supporting the opposition to avoid alignment with Washington, aligning itself with Mexico and Colombia, trying to find an intermediate solution for the crisis that did not work out. So the result was even further isolation from Brazil, lack of leverage, right? And conflicting messages from within the Brazilian government. So some voices in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are favoring restoring Brazil's influence through moderate diplomacy, but there are other voices in Brazil's government who truly believe that supporting Maduro implicitly prevents deeper U.S. penetration in the region. So the government is divided. So if we should support Maduro, or if we try to contain Maduro, or if we try to engage Maduro, right? So the price of ambiguity has become too high. Brazil has lost a capacity to lead, to be a regional leader, to have influence in Venezuela. Its credibility is questioned at home and abroad concerning the issue of Venezuela and Essequibo. And now there is a risk of a border invasion have become real. The possibility of Venezuela invading Essequibo is still very low, but the mere fact that we have to discuss this issue is already a symptom of how the situation has deteriorated in the last years in South America. Right? So Brazil needs a new strategy. Right? We first tried full isolation with Bolsonaro, did not work concerning Venezuela. Then we tried diplomatic engagement and did not work either. So we are discussing a separate that we need to come up with an intermediate sort of strategy, which is engagement with force. You must combine diplomatic pressure, economic re-engagement, and military deterrence, right? On the side of diplomatic pressure, without isolating Venezuela, which is very important. The previous administration of Bolsonaro wanted to isolate Venezuela. It did not work at all. Actually, it worked in favor of Venezuela, of the regime. So first, we need to appoint a special envoy to Venezuela to reduce exposure of President Lula inner circle. We have to host and to welcome moderate oppositions leaders in Brasilia to signal the regime in Venezuela that we know and we have contact with them. We have to increase our pressure at the UN level to always vote against the regime on the issues of Venezuela they are discussing at that level. We have to use our capacity at BRICS to always block Venezuela from entering BRICS. And we did that in the last year, and we have to continue to do so. Unless they start a democratic transition in Venezuela, there is no way Venezuela ever will become a full member of BRICS, no matter how much Russia or China want to be. If Brazil says no, as it did, Venezuela will never become a member. But we need to have economic re-engagement for leverage. We used to have I mean, if you go to Caracas in the 2013s, half of their food products were coming from Brazil. Now they don't buy anything from Brazil anymore. The sanctions don't help either. A lot of Brazilian companies do not want to return to Venezuela because they're afraid of secondary sanctions from the United States. If they have business in the U.S., why would they go there? But we have to, the government especially has to incentivize private companies in Brazil, but also state companies to go back to Venezuela. Because if you don't have domestic economic leverage inside Venezuela, Venezuela will never respect your position. Because that's what's going on in Brazil today. Brazil has no political leverage inside Venezuela whatsoever. Zero, zero, zero. The countries that actually have political influence in Venezuela are Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, and the United States because of the sanctions. We, as Brazil, they don't actually. Maduro does not need to listen to Lula for anything. He can continue in power without any, without even the regard of Lula's position. In this sense, we have to rebuild the Petrobras-PDVSA relationship with some conditionalities, and we have to use trade incentives in general to influence the Venezuela political crisis. We have to show the Venezuelans that they are going to be, especially the bourgeoisie, the business sector of Venezuela, that they're going to be better off with a democratic transition than they are today. And the third vector, if you say instrument that we have to use concerning the regime there, is military and security realignment. And I think that the first one is that we have to strengthen defense cooperation with Guyana. That's number one and foremost. If it's necessary, we have to come up with a security agreement inspired by the U.S., South Korea, or India, Bangladesh model. That we have to make sure to the Venezuelan regime, and if they invade Guyana, they will be invading Brazil, right? So this is for that to happen, we have to have an official military defense and security treaty with Guyana. I don't know if Brazil going to try that, but it will send a strong signal to Caracas that they cannot and they should not even consider, no matter how much they feel about the region of Essequibo, they should not consider to invade that region. Brazil should not allow ever for that region to invade. If you look at the map, and if Venezuela actually invades Essequibo, the northern border will be enveloped. So the pressure of Roraima state, you have Venezuelans on all sides, will increase tremendously. It's a very difficult state to protect because it's beyond the Amazon basin, right? You cannot drive a car from São Paulo and Rio all the way to Roraima. There are no roads there. The only way you can get there is by airplane or boats. It takes weeks. Even to move our military there, it takes 2 to 3 weeks. It's a very complicated region, right? So Venezuela has a full pressure of it. It's the gateway of all the immigrants. Brazil has now almost 1 million Venezuelan immigrants in our society here, and they are very welcome because we need the Venezuelans. Right? We also need to explore possibility of a military security and defense agreement with Colombia on the issue of Guyana. We have to have a 3-country strategy to pressure Venezuela and send a signal to the regime that they should not even consider to make an invasion of Essequibo. In addition to that, just to lead into my conclusion, the biggest challenge of Brazil is not Venezuela per se, but is these other great powers closer to Brazilian border. What I tried to convey to the Workers' Party here, the Lula's party, is that the idea that Maduro is fighting against American imperialism is not only outdated, but is absolutely wrong. Actually, the fact that Venezuela is unstable, it welcomes and invites the United States for a possible invasion in the future or to put more pressure on the Venezuelan regime. So actually, this regime today, Maduro's regime, is a threat to Brazil's national territorial integrity. So even the left in Brazil have to come to the terms and change a little bit the way they perceive the regime. So the idea that you have to fight the United States in every corner of the world just because they are the imperialists of the world In the case of Venezuela, that is wrong. We also have to talk to Russia and China. We have to show them how, if they get closer and if they continue to support Venezuela, they will be working against their relationship with Brazil. For China and for Russia, Brazil is a much more important country. And incomparable to Venezuela, we are BRIC members. We have a very strong trade and commercial ties with both countries. Russia has a surplus of almost $10 billion with Brazil. Russia is today Brazil's 5th largest trade partner. And if it continues that way, it will be our 3rd. We buy everything the Russians have to sell in the world. We'll buy everything, and we will continue to buy. There's nothing that will change that. Fertilizers, diesel, and so on and so forth. They don't buy much of our stuff. We have this little leverage with the Russians and say, look, if you continue to support Venezuela, and if Venezuela is becoming a threat to us, then you're gonna risk the relationship we have with you, right? And for China and for Russia, Brazil is a much more important country. So Brazil must urgently change its foreign policy to concern Venezuela, to its neighborhood in general. The combination of authoritarian drift in Venezuela, territorial aggression toward Guyana, and great power rivalry demands a new strategic posture for Brazil. We're going to have election next year, 2026. I doubt that President Lula will have time or even consider to change its strategy to Venezuela today, because as of today, President Lula's strategy to Venezuela is to contain Venezuela, to not talk about Venezuela, to avoid Venezuela as much as possible, right? Until we have election in November last year. So there is a lot to happen in Venezuela. We're going to have an election, again, very biased and manipulated election coming up in Venezuela next year. In Brazil, as probably other countries in the region, we don't see any change in Venezuela in the next couple of years. But Brazil has to have a different strategy. And the goal of this strategy must be to help Venezuelans to make a democratic transition from an authoritarian regime to a more democratic and stable political system in Venezuela. That will work in favor of Brazil's position in the region. So thank you very much, IISS, IIS, if I said right, and Irene, for your invitation.
Thanks, Feliciano. No, that was really interesting. A follow-up question, just if I may, on what you were discussing. It's interesting also how actually Brazil kind of perceive the U.S. as an extraterritorial power, because it's true, it is extra South American. But my question is, going back to our question on really interstate tension, and also actually looking at, I'm trying to also summarize some of the question online. I guess what you mentioned also, the basically tension on Venezuela with the U.S. And in general on secondary sanction. Do you see a higher risk of conflict also directly between Brazil and the U.S.? And I'm thinking also looking at domestic matters in Brazil, right? Listening to Bolsonaro saying, that foreign intervention is needed to sort out democratic institution in Brazil. Do you see that? I suppose the answer would be no, but you never know, in the madness of the moment. Do you see a possible new areas of friction or kind of more friction between Brazil and the U.S.? Also considering that, as you say, obviously Brazil is very close also to China and India, at least economically.
Yeah,
India.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I was at the Munich Security Conference 2 months ago, and I was at the last. I was representing SEBRI, and I was at the last meeting of the conference where they convene all the think tanks. And a lot of the think tanks, they're predominantly from the West. They were talking about Russian intervention in the interference in democratic in the elections in Europe. And when it came to for me to speak, I say, look, we in Brazil, we are not concerned with any possible Russian interference in our elections. We are very much concerned with the Trump administration interference in 2026 election. You have to have in mind that Elon Musk lost in Brazil. Twitter was banned in Brazil. I was a Twitter user, and Twitter was banned for 4 months. I never fully returned to Twitter, and millions of Brazilians never returned to Twitter after that. So Musk is losing a lot of money here, and he in many tweets, he already mentioned that he wants President Lula out. And so at least from this perspective, all the algorithms in these social medias, they will work against President Lula in 2026. And Bolsonaro is trying, his family is trying very hard convince American authorities to be more aggressive against Brazil's Supreme Court. I don't know if you're following, as you mentioned, the situation of yesterday. President Bolsonaro was indicted. He's going to be condemned, very likely, and his penalty is going to be 30 years in jail. It's I mean, the amount of evidence that they gather, the federal police gather against President Bolsonaro attempted coup in January in 2023 is overwhelming. It's impossible for them, and not only President Bolsonaro, but many generals from the army. Almost 15 generals from the army are going to go to jail for the first time in our history. And he has this very close relationship with President Trump, with the MAGA faction. As of today, President Lula has no political connection with anyone in the Republican Party in a high level. They don't have any connection. So there is an ongoing crisis that is going to boil up and explode in 2026. So the relationship between Brazil and the United States will deteriorate to this point next year. And we'll have to learn how to deal with that.
Yeah, as all of us, I suppose, across the world. Unfortunately, we are almost, I mean, we have another 10 minutes. So I think I'll try to condense some of the questions we had. I guess one interesting one, which was also my question, is if you had to assess basically the probability of interstate tension, what are the ones that are most risky and also with larger implication? And also, just to add to the question we had from Leao, is there any other areas or any other part of South America where we can expect to see some interstate tension appear related to Trump in particular? I don't know if a question for all of you. I don't know. Yeah, Evan, if you want to get started with that.
There we go. Sure. No, absolutely. Really kind of to recap a couple of the points that I made before. So first of all, I think you have some of the minor issues and completely concur with Dr. Guimarães with respect to Brazil's imperative with the geography of how Venezuela would invade Esquibo if it did, going through Roraima State there, and the imperative of defending. My perception is that because of the if the Russian army was in bad shape trying to think about invading Ukraine because of accumulated corruption, I think the difficulties the Venezuelan army would have, especially getting away from their Cuban minders in a deployment to Esquibo, to me that's much more of a blackmail that Maduro is applying rather than, and especially now with the Trump administration, I think that continues to be a threat, but not so much. In my personal sense, as I indicated before, with respect to kind of some of the Trump administration threats, whether it's militarily grab Panama, other things, while because of the perhaps lack of institutional experience of Secretary of Defense Hegseth, I worry that with some of President Trump's ideas, you might not have a Secretary of Defense with the weight and experience to say, no, Mr. President, or we cannot do this legally, Mr. President. So I think there's a risk there, but my sense is that those things about Panama are more used as threats for bargaining rather than are serious indications of military action. And so where that brings me back to is that, to me, the biggest possible risk really comes out of the possibility through miscalculation or through an emboldened China of a war in the Indo-Pacific that involves Latin America. And then, of course, you do have some of the minor skirmishes, which I think really spill out from the difficulties in criminal activities, but those are more border skirmishes from states which are captured by narcos more than they are, I would say, traditional interstate territorial disputes per se.
That's great. There is a question actually probably for you, Feliciano, which is more actually following up on what you were saying in terms of secondary sanction. So there is a question asking whether the North American investor in infrastructure or tech in South America should expect reprisal as a result of these geopolitical issues, and obviously secondary sanction from Trump. What do you see the situation being?
So
in South
I
America?
was invited by the Minister of Foreign Affairs to write a chapter on a book that they're launching about sanctions in general, but sanctions against Latin American countries. I know Brazil is the official position of the Brazilian foreign policy is always to be against sanction. Actually, we are not allowed. Our constitution does not allow Brazil to impose any sanction in any country unless there is an authorization by the UN Security Council. So from a diplomatic point of view, Brazil is always going to be against sanctions. It believes that the sanctions create more problems than solutions. In the case of Brazil, for any investors, we might be subject to sanctions coming up from the Trump administration if the situation concerning the Brazilian Supreme Court deteriorates. What the Bolsonaro family is trying to do in Florida, in the United States, is to convince American authorities to impose sanctions against specific individuals in Brazil, the judges and the prosecutors that are working against them. So now it's up to the United States to make a decision on that. I think if they decided to do so, it's totally plausible that they can do so. If they decided to do so, they will destroy the bilateral relationship because President Lula has no alternative but to react, to reciprocate, right? As of today, in the government in Brazil, there is we don't, as anybody, as all the other countries in the world, we don't know how to deal with Trump. So there is the group that think that we need to actually always reciprocate. If they attack, we attack back. And there is the other group of the people that want that we need to negotiate and try to open a negotiation. But then we look at the Panama situation. So Panama wanted to negotiate. Panama helped the Americans to get rid of the Chinese companies in the canal, and the Americans continued to pressure Panama. So I'm more and more. Initially, I was in favor of negotiating. So I'm more and more now. I look at the Mexican example. I really like the Mexican president. She knows how to deal with Americans, and we need to learn. I think they don't. Professor Serrano already disagree with me, but from our perspective, I think that she's learning. I think we cannot repeat Panama. We need to be tough. Maybe Trump only respects whoever is tough against him. If you try to negotiate, he will go over you. So we'll have to see. Brazil is not priority for the United States, so we have some time still. It's not like Mexico or Canada or Panama, so we have some time, but it will reach us. So we'll see.
Definitely. Monica?
Mexico, I mean, the president has had, I think, a savvy strategy domestically, in the sense that her discourse claims that she's not negotiating, she's not receiving US officials to inform, but to coordinate. That's what she said just yesterday about the visit of one of the top officials from the Trump administration. But in effect, she has given in a lot, perhaps more so than Canada. 10,000 troops were deployed to the north, 29 traffickers were handed over. The one thing that she has been restrained on is on not declaring that she will swiftly impose tariffs in retaliation. So today, Trump says, if Canada and the UA dare, the European Union dare to coordinate, we will double up. She has kept quiet. And I think, I mean, people in Mexico interpret that as something she learned from dealing with a macho, López Obrador. and so that's why she keeps quiet and with a pretty face. But the fact of the matter is that she's made huge concessions, and the results have not differed for Canada or Mexico.
That's a good point.
But I think I take your point in that the personal strategy is important, but if you, depending on your vulnerability, you will have to concede ground, as Canada and Mexico have done.
We are much less. Sorry, can I just comment? We are much less vulnerable in the case of Brazil. Our U.S. is our second trade partner. If the tariffs are fully imposed, we'll have more options than Mexico, I think.
Yeah,
I'm quite sure.
Yeah. For sure.
And also, what I think is good is that Claudia is using that domestically to increase her popularity. So we have an election next year in Brazil, so that might give President Lula the impression that he can, fight back Trump to gain politically next year from an electoral point of view. So that's something.
Good point. Just because we are running out of time, but Evan, I will leave you also time to add to this conversation. I just wanted to touch on two final points. I know we are running a little bit over, but I think it's very important. One is the migration, all the migration. We had quite a lot of questions on the migration issue, whether it's actually used as a tool of destabilization, obviously sending migrants back. And also the other part was the human kind of right aspect of really, in a way, internationalizing what we've seen with, the deportation to El Salvador. In a way, we're seeing actually a internationalization of Bukele state of exception to the rest of the world, right? Because that's how we are treating now the Venezuelan being extradited there. So there's one question. The other question, which is very short, is what is the role of Europe? Do you see actually a role for Europe there? Is it possible that Europe could be another counterbalance there, even if we know that Europe is already struggling to do so in the Ukraine kind of crisis closer to home? So the last final word, three of you pick whatever you want of the three questions. And Evan, if you want to add also on the conversation, on the previous conversation, feel free.
On the migration, briefly, I think Venezuela is one of the big drivers. And Feliciano has just mentioned the 1 million in Brazil, if not 1 million, a significant number in Colombia. In Mexico, the number of Venezuelans is also impressive. I personally now encounter them as neighbors in my building, in the market where I buy fruits. And this is something that needs to be tackled. I think it's a problem that has proven to be unmanageable. Brazil has tried, as Feliciano very well explained, shared with us. The European countries have tried, but it seems to me that if something is not done about Venezuela, that migration flow will continue and they will persist, spread around the region. I personally think that despite Biden's best intentions to try to bring order into migration flows, the strategy to allow migrants by getting appointments to then claim asylum once in the US acted as a magnet for a migrant flow that turned Mexico in a country of transit for nationalities from all around the world. I documented the ambassador from Senegal referring to this, and I think that tragically, the fact that it became an orderly flow means that they are traceable and they are the first vulnerable to be expelled and to be deported. I don't know if the courts will have any power to stop that. Central America, we see again the push factors in Mexico as well, violence and criminal violence acting as a driver for internal displacement and migration. That is something that is also a reality, and unless drug policy changes, the chances of that and strategy changes as well, the chances of containing that will not be great.
Evan?
Sure. A couple of quick questions or points. First of all, I think on migration, there is a really interesting legal issue, an international legal issue with respect to this idea of the Trump administration, not only in terms of our internal laws, but then deporting to a prison in El Salvador, which is willing to accept questions of due process there, and so I think that will continue to play out. Also, there's a question that as the U.S. has this push against against migration here and secures the border, where does the migration go? I think, as Monica pointed out, you have, certainly without solving the Venezuelan problem, you'll continue to have Venezuelan migration, probably more pressure rather than less on Cuba, on Haitian out-migration, probably on Ecuadorian out-migration, especially depending on what happens in the upcoming elections. I think part of that may actually try to go more towards Europe. Also, there's the question that, as you have the imposition of more tariffs, especially these multiple tariffs that are taking place in April on Mexico and elsewhere, will that accelerate migration from, other regions even more? I think the secondary role of Europe beyond migration is there's a question that Europe becomes the logical second focus of diversification. Not all diversification economically is going to be Europe, I think logically because of some of the agreements with the EU with respect to Mexico, with respect to Mercosur. Europe may become the lead beneficiary of that search for diversification. And then finally, with respect to President Trump, although speaking from a North American U.S. perspective, I don't think here there is an understanding any more than in Latin America or Europe, some of the dynamics, but I think it's very personal. I think there's a combination of elements. Number one is the unique factors. I agree with my colleagues that, for example, President Trump seems to have a particular disdain for Canada. I think from his past business dealings that has probably colored the way he dealt with Justin Trudeau and frankly from Trudeau himself from the first administration. And I think that reflects also into some of his attitudes towards certain European leaders. But you also have a question of the size, I think, of countries gets you a little bit of extra. So I think both Mexico and Brazil benefit from the fact that being essentially large enough that Trump thinks twice about applying pressure and bullying, something that frankly Panama nor Colombia with Gustavo Petro receive that same amount of deference. I think there's this idea of respect cuts both ways. I think there's a sense that Claudia Sheinbaum at least verbally deferred to Trump. She kind of kissed the ring, and so that I think she understands well, as AMLO understood, that buys a certain amount, and yet you have to both kiss the ring and be a big enough state. In other words, it wasn't enough for President Molino in Panama to just kiss the ring. You have to be big enough and show deference, I think, to get that winning combination. At least that's my personal read from what I've seen on the side.
That's a great point. Feliciano?
On the issue of migration, so there are two aspects here. First is that we are, as just like other Latin American countries, we're receiving more and more immigrants from Venezuela. In the case of Brazil, we need immigrants. So the more the Venezuelans come, the better it is for us, right? So we are reaching 1 million immigrants. So we created this Operation Acolhida, which is a welcoming operation on the northern border of Brazil. Before the election last year, we were receiving approximately 1,000 individuals per day. Now the numbers went up to 1,500. We believe these numbers are going to go up. As Professor Serrano mentioned, I see Venezuelans all over Brazil now. It's good for us. We run survey. I have a piece coming out in Foreign Policy Magazine with a Venezuelan friend of mine. We run a survey asking the Venezuelan immigrants in 5 different countries what they think of life on those countries. 4 countries were very negative. They feel xenophobia, they're difficult to work. So Chile, Peru, Colombia, United States. The only one that the service came out positive is Brazil. So that was striking. Why Venezuelans like to live here? I know how difficult it is to live in Brazil. So trust me. So there's something there. We need more immigrants. But the other aspect is the Brazilians who are being deported from the United States. The numbers didn't go up yet. They will go up. But it seems that the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs may manage to negotiate with the State Department in a way to do it more calmly and organized. So we hopefully that will work out. But there was one flight that the Brazilians were very mistreated by the American authorities. So the government here is starting to use this rally around the flag. The Petro from Colombia escalated, and then he had to back down. So Brazil almost escalated. So they saw what happened to Colombia, so they backtracked and said, "Look, wait, let's." But they were about to escalate too. So we're learning and how to deal with it. And just one note on the Europeans. I mean, I've been talking to the Europeans my whole academic life. I've been talking about the Mercosur European Union trade agreement. Now it's in the European Council for voting. They don't have enough votes yet. Hopefully they will agree on and they will approve this treaty. That will give Europe one more strategic partner, which is Mercosur, Brazil and Argentina. Nowadays, Europe needs way more Brazil and Argentina than us need them. So it's up to the Europeans now to approve this deal and improve our relationship with them. So thank you again for the questions.
Thanks so much. And with that, unfortunately, we have to conclude the webinar. We have so many things we started to discuss. We didn't have time to follow up, but hopefully we'll do another webinar soon. Thanks so much